interviewed a young girl named Amina.
Okay, that's good. Okay, what I'm going to do is a quick introduction to the First Nations of Canada to put what Shiela has been doing into context, because we are the second biggest country in the world, going from the extreme Arctic down to areas that are actually south of the latitude of Eureka, California. The original tribes that inhabited Canada before the Europeans arrived are shown here. The area of the Ojibwa, Algonquin, Iroquois here is the area with which Shiela will be talking. We have an immense mix of First Nations, and the same thing is true in Canada, although it thins out the farther north you get. The area shown by these artifacts is pretty well the area of Ontario where Shiela was working. There are about 1 million First Nations, 644 different identifiable First Nations. 53% still live on reserves in 2017, and most of the rest live in major cities. The smallest First Nations, some of them claim to be in line to be UN nations, have less than 10 members. So this remains a major conflict. Some First Nations have more than 5,000 to 10,000 persons each. They're very small. They are very dispersed. The most northerly one is Grise Fiord, that's 76 north. And it was not there originally. They were actually sent there as an attempt by the government back in the 50s to defend the north. And they have a rough time. It's a kind of northern welfare. They should probably not have been sent there, but there are still 162 people hanging on to that. These are the most northerly communities. Most of them are about 1,000 people in them. A lot of consolidation was done, but they are still spread over literally tens of thousands of square miles. The 10 largest First Nations are much farther south. Some of the areas in the area that Shiela will talk about involve the 2 largest, the 6 Nations, the Akwesasne, and several of the other ones. That shows roughly the clusters of First Nations in the north, and these are the ones which are dominant in Ontario, which has by far the largest concentration of Native peoples. There were 4.9% of the total population of Canada, including Métis and Inuit. The Inuit are in the very far north, many north of 60 and north of the Arctic Circle. Now, what you have to realize is that this is a major challenge for education. Often these communities are inaccessible. You can't even get in and out of them during large parts of the season, particularly during the melting period. You can only get in and out by boat for about 1 month of the year in the very far north, and even in areas as far south as Ontario. So it's a major challenge, and Canada has in fact got heavily involved in involving the peoples themselves and in distance education. And now I'm going to turn this over to a very specific success story that Sheila's going to come and tell you about. You take the chair, yeah, right up there.
Ted has very thick carpets. Thank you very much. It really is a pleasure to be with such good friends and colleagues for almost a decade or more. And I just want to thank Anitra, Marilyn, and Ryan for putting all this together. And hopefully you didn't mind that we sent such a lengthy email with all these slides. I should say that I rely on people having read the information on the slides, because what I'd like to do is, under these 5 headings, just talk about the story of how the First Nations belonging to the Union of Ontario Indians made negotiations such a success. And on that basis, I'd like to thank Tracy. Her name really is Marie Elena Tracy O'Donnell. She has been the, I guess, the legal expert for negotiations of self-government through different agreements since 1995. I first met her when I was the chief federal negotiator for this particular education agreement. And she was brilliant then and is brilliant now. And yesterday I had a conversation with her that lasted almost 2 hours. And with that, she said to me, would you like to use all my slides? So what I've got is the slides, I guess, that Tracy provided me with. Now, I don't intend to go through each one, but I'd like to weave the story using those slides. And she spoke to KCOR in the early days of negotiations, and I think that was probably about 1996 or 1997. I was involved from 1995 to 2002 as a chief federal negotiator, and in 2002 we signed a deal, we being Canada and the First Nations belonging to the Union of Ontario Indians. And that negotiation was under number 1 on the list here, and it was negotiation of the transfer of jurisdiction over Indigenous education in Canada. In other words, self-government in Canada was a primary priority, I guess I should say, of the government of the day in 1995. And that was to permit over a period of time all First Nations in Canada, all of them who chose to be self-governing, to start negotiations on a variety of topics. The Union of Ontario Indians, which comprises the, I guess, 47 First Nations, although the number changes depending on whether there's some dispute or not. But anyways, so the chiefs, through band council resolutions, confirm their membership in the Union of Ontario Indians on a regular basis. And that is the governance group, the Chiefs Council, that signs any agreement with Canada. So the governance of the First Nations, I'll quickly move to that, because the governance of the First Nations, of course, is similar to that of the First Nations, I'll call them, in North America and in the United States. And so our governance in general in Canada, under the Constitution in Canada, reflects the democratic laws of First Nations before the Europeans ever arrived. And so the governance of the First Nations I dealt with, their views and actions and are reflected in both the agreement in principle that I was part of and the final agreement. And you'll find, if you choose to look for the final agreement, or you can ask me for a copy of the agreement in principle, that they're very, very democratic. They sign on by vote, ratification. They sign on to any agreement, and then that ratification vote is, of course, overseen by others, the Union of Ontario Indians, and then whoever has the majority becomes a member of that agreement. So out of the 47 First Nations of the Union of Ontario Indians, 23 First Nations signed on final education agreement. And that was care playing practical First Nations who dealt with Canada for 300-400 years. Well, before it was Canada, so it's 150 years at least. And they're very skeptical about the serpent talk of the government, of the federal government. And I've heard that described, and that's probably one of the nicest ways it was described to me when I was first introduced. And the third point I want to cover is the Anishinaabe education system. And of course, the jurisdiction was handed over because it could show the negotiating team for the Union of Ontario Indians was peopled by 4 tremendous people. And there was trust by the Union that these representatives would carry out and make sure that the traditional governance by First Nations of their activities would be reflected in the agreement in principle and the final agreement. The agreement in principle really was designed to set out the principles that would be, and the content that would be adhered to in the final agreement. And I believe that was done. Final agreement took 23 years. It was finally agreed to in 2018. As you can see there, the education system is now in place, been in place for 2 years. And the governing body of that education system is known as a Kino Madswin education body. And it really is a success story because it now has 2,700 students from K to high school, really up to post-secondary education. And that is children who belong, or whose membership and whose family membership is part of a First Nation, one of the 23. However, there are 47 First Nations, and in those First Nations in which there is no, they have not signed on yet, because 9 are lined up and they have to do it in a sequential fashion in order to deal with the increase in students, get the funding, get the teachers, the program, etc., and adjust other agreements. So there are 9 waiting, and there are 10 in line, and other First Nations who do not belong to the Union of Ontario Indians, but who live nearby, because there's a mixture between the Union of Ontario Indians, the bodies, or the various Indian tribes that are represented there are Potawatomi, Chippewa, Ojibwe, and I'll show you a map on that. But and there's an occasional Assiniboine, and I spoke with one person. I said, "You should be in Manitoba," and he said, "In one of the battles 100 years ago, I was taken away as a small kid and raised as an Ojibwa." So in some sense, the future looks much better than the past. So the future plans I'm going to deal with really depend on the education of the youth. And you'll see in some of the photographs towards the end of the slides that there is a youth group. They have a group that they meet with once a year in the forum, asking for priorities, plans, what is missing, what should be done, where can they go, and so on and so forth. And there are other, there's another slide showing a parent with kids in kindergarten. So with that, I'll start moving quickly through the slides. You can see that this is the most southern group of First Nations in Canada, except on the border of the western provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and of course, British Columbia. One of the first self-governing First Nations is in Alberta, right in the border, and they have a tremendous wine growing business. Very good wine too. So that's in the Okanagan. That's called Westbrook. So here are the people, the First Nations and the names of all the reserves. Now there is a mix because the yellow one in the Southwest region is all Mohawk or Iroquoian. And then there's a mix in the green, and you can see the members of First Nations. And if you have the copies of these slides, you'll be able to read the member First Nations. And as I said, the best of times is 47 and maybe 50, and the worst of times it could be many fewer. And of course, they have to resolve the discord that has originated or caused the split. So Ottawa has a group there, Algonquins, Waklagan, and then North Bay, there are Chippewa, there are Ojibwe, etc. And you move further west and you have the same mix. So I'll move on. And this is what I was involved in. And it's, you can see Anishinaabeg refers to the First Nation name, and Anishinaabe with a double A-B-E refers to the people. So there's the negotiating team, and that I have to identify me because once I didn't have white hair. So I'm in the back of that group. Next to me is the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs at the time, that's 2002. And my counterpart across the table sadly departed about 10 years ago because of diabetes. So that's Merle Pegamagabo. His ancestry is Potawatomi, and they left the Aztecs to come north. And to his left is the Grand Chief at the time, and he's head of the Council of Chiefs for the 47 First Nations, a very powerful figure. And he's wearing the traditional headdress, which was eagle feathers, but not the grand headdress of the Plains Indians. And sitting in front, it was the council, or the Grand Chief of the time, and the local member of parliament for the area. And the area was Majindakening, and that was Rama First Nation, which is one of the richest because it has a superb casino. If you're a governor, or if you're a gambler rather. Across the front of the table is the Ojibwe and Union of Ontario Indians Wampum Belt, which is the history. There's the part of the AIP that I just wanted to show because we had many parts. And as you could see, during negotiations leading to a final agreement, Canada and the participating First Nations will discuss how the participating First Nations will establish an Anishinaabe education system. And that leads me to tell you about education in Canada, because we have an Indian Act, and I have to say, declare my bias against it. It's a very tricky act and really does not support self-governing First Nations. But anyhow, the Anishinaabe education system had been a dream for years, and how it was going to govern itself was a big issue. So this is how the Kino Mats went, and you can see the difference in spelling. And every time I, thought I had the spelling right, somebody'd say, but in our First Nation, we don't spell it that way. So you could see what the principles and the actual clauses in the final agreement had to be constant and aligned with this. And in Canada, because of the Indian Act, and that's what it's called, the Minister of Education, or Minister of Indian Affairs, I'll use the short term there, he had total jurisdiction over everything that happened to the First Nation, which was then called a reserve, even to the point that he had authority over any mortgage that any Native person, any Anishinaabe might have. In other words, he had to, that person or the descendants had to get the agreement of the minister once that person died, because the minister had the final say over any dispute over a will. So it was time to move on. But that gives you an idea of what the final agreement looked like. And here we are. And there's my great colleague and friend, Marie Elena Tracy O'Donnell. And this is all her work and how she presented what was happening to the federal government, to Canada, and to the Minister of Indian Affairs, and all the members of Parliament in an appeal, well, not a presentation requesting approval of this agreement so they would have jurisdiction and governance over their education. Then it went to the Senate of Canada and it was approved there, and then it was declared to be an act of Canada in 2018. And it's very important to know this, because if you're negotiating in a government that is a federal system, and I don't know, John, what if you have to deal with governance of this kind in South Africa, but we have to have double bilateral agreements when you're talking about education in Canada. And with the Indian Act, you had to have Canada approve, but Canada has no jurisdiction over education or health. That's what the provinces have jurisdiction over. So early on, because I had a background in education and knew a lot of the people in the provincial Ontario government, I was able to talk to people and say, we really need to start negotiations of some kind between the Union of Ontario Indians and First Nations and the negotiating team, because approval of the curriculum of this Anishinaabeg education master agreement and education system means that First Nation, the Anishinaabe graduates of their education system can move about and to other provinces. So we have to have a curriculum aligned and achievement goals and so on and so forth. So that started early. So that gives you an idea of the 4 regions. And the biggest one, of course, is the Lake Huron region. But it takes 15 hours to drive from Muncie, Delaware in the most southwest, and that's the yellow First Nation, to the far west, and that's Fort William on near Thunder Bay on Lake Ontario. And I asked Tracy, how long do you take when you drive? And I know she's a mad driver. And she said 15 hours. So that gives you an idea of the distance. The most distant one is Long Lake, and that's on the northern tip of Lake Nipigon. And we never visited that one because it was the legal counsel refused to go. Anyways, not ours, not Canada's, but the others. But we would have had to fly in. because there's no road access.
Shiela,
Okay,
we're running
so-
out of time.
okay, well then I've told the story. And the story is they're now self-governing and they have full control of their education system. It's culturally appropriate. The government of Canada has no authority over the Anish education system. First Nations have full authority to determine priorities and expenditure of education funds. And one of the agreements forming the master agreement is one on fiscal. It's a fiscal agreement. And fiscal transfer is a grant. It's grant funding. And there's clear evidence, even in 2 years, of student success. So they're very happy. I'll put, my friend here tells me to move along here.
Then just go to the end one with all the success stories.
Oh yeah.
You get there.
That's an elder, and that's part of the cultural training, I would say, and of kids. And education's delivered in the classroom, online, and on the land. Science, geography, and biology is taught on the land. In other words, field trips. And so they can understand how the nature plays a great part, of course, in their belief systems and their culture. It's very rich culture. And there's the youth forum. And in development, they're going to have language and cultural competency. I can't imagine how I would produce SE, we do, whatever. And they have a youth council, and they're now negotiating major capital negotiations to build schools and, of course, equip kids with computers. And there's a celebration, of course, and the kids who dance have to make their own costumes. And there's another, of course, music and language and drum session. Kids in kindergarten, and there's an elder speaking with children about the cultural background. Okay.